There comes a moment when God doesn't rush you forward. He asks you to pause right where you are, because clarity is about to catch up with your courage. You didn't imagine the weight, the confusion, the nights you questioned your own strength, and the seasons that felt like they were stretching longer than you could endure. What you survived wasn't random. And what you're standing in right now isn't wasted. God saw every tear you swallowed, every prayer you whispered when words failed you, and every time you kept showing up with faith that felt fragile. This pause is not punishment, it's preparation, because heaven is aligning perspective with purpose. I know it didn't make sense when doors closed without explanation, when people walked away without warning, and when your prayers felt like they echoed back unanswered. But hear me clearly. God was teaching you how to breathe in the middle of pressure, how to trust without control, and how to stand when everything familiar was shaking. 2026 is not just another year on the calendar, it's a divine reveal, where God begins to connect the dots of everything you thought broke you. What hurt you refined you, what delayed you protected you, and what confused you positioned you for wisdom you couldn't have handled back then. So if this word is reaching you, I want you to lean in and receive it with expectation. Like this video, if you're ready to trust God's timing, even when it doesn't match your plans, subscribe if you're believing for clarity and restoration in this next season. And comment where you're watching from, because faith grows stronger when we stand together. God didn't tell you to pause so you could quit. He told you to pause so you could see. And when 2026 unfolds, you'll finally understand why you had to survive everything you did. There are moments when God speaks not through movement, but through stillness, not through acceleration, but through a holy pause. And I know that can feel unsettling when you have spent so long pushing, praying, pressing, and persevering. We live in a world that celebrates speed, productivity, and constant motion. So when God says pause, it can feel like rejection, like failure, like you missed something or didn't do enough. But God's pause is not denial. It is divine alignment, and alignment requires stillness so that what is out of order can come back into agreement with heaven. Sometimes God has to slow your steps because your future is arriving with weight, and He refuses to let you enter it fractured, exhausted, or unclear. The pause is not meant to shrink you, it is meant to settle you so you can carry what's coming without breaking under the pressure of it. You have to understand that alignment is not something you rush into. It is something that happens when God recalibrates your heart, your expectations, and your perspective. There are things God wants to give you that would overwhelm the version of you that kept running on adrenaline and survival. You were strong, yes, but you were also tired. You were faithful, but you were also carrying wounds you never gave yourself time to heal from. God is not impressed by how fast you move when your soul is bleeding. He is concerned with how whole you are when you arrive. So when He said pause, He was saying, let me tend to the parts of you that were ignored while you were busy being brave. Let me realign your identity so you don't confuse productivity with purpose or movement with meaning. The pause is where God begins to whisper instead of shout, because noise drowns out discernment. When you are always moving, you don't always notice when you've drifted slightly off course. Not drastically wrong, just subtly misaligned. And subtle misalignment can lead to significant damage over time. God pauses you not because you are lost, but because He wants to fine-tune your direction. He wants to ensure that when you take the next step, you are stepping with intention, clarity, and peace instead of pressure. The pause becomes the sacred space where God removes urgency that didn't come from Him and replaces it with confidence that is rooted in trust. There are prayers you prayed that God did not ignore. He simply answered them with timing instead of immediacy. You asked for peace, but peace doesn't thrive in chaos, so God had to pause the chaos. You ask for clarity, but clarity cannot live where there is constant distraction, so God had to quiet the noise. You ask for strength, but strength that never rests becomes reckless, so God had to teach you how to be still without feeling guilty. The pause is God honoring your prayer in a way that protects you. He is not withholding, He is preparing. He is not delaying out of indifference, He is delaying out of care. Divine alignment often feels uncomfortable because it exposes what has been out of sync. It reveals habits you leaned on that God never assigned. It confronts expectations you picked up from people who never carried your calling. It challenges timelines you created out of fear instead of faith. When God pauses you, He is not just adjusting your steps, He is adjusting your vision. He is teaching you how to see without striving, how to trust without controlling, how to wait without losing hope. Waiting in alignment feels different than waiting in confusion. There is a quiet assurance that settles in your spirit, a gentle knowing that God is at work even when nothing around you appears to be moving. You didn't fail because you stopped. You didn't lose momentum because you rested. You didn't fall behind because God asked you to slow down. Heaven does not measure progress the way people do. God is more concerned with direction than speed. He is more invested in formation than performance. He would rather take you through a pause than rush you into a promise you're not yet aligned to steward. Alignment means your heart can handle the blessing without becoming attached to it in unhealthy ways. Alignment means your character can sustain the elevation without collapsing under pride or fear. Alignment means your faith is anchored in God, not outcomes. The pause is also where God separates what looks good from what is God. When you are moving fast, every opportunity feels urgent, every open door feels like confirmation. But in the pause, discernment sharpens. You begin to notice which doors carry peace and which ones carry pressure. You begin to recognize when something is draining you instead of developing you. God uses the pause to teach you how to say no without explanation and yes without anxiety. Alignment brings clarity, and clarity brings peace, not the kind of peace that comes from having everything figured out, but the kind that comes from trusting the one who does. There is a tenderness to God's pause that we often overlook. It is His way of saying, you don't have to earn my approval by exhausting yourself. You don't have to prove your worth through constant output. You are allowed to breathe. You are allowed to be human. You are allowed to need rest. The pause reminds you that your value is not in what you produce, but in who you belong to. When God aligns you, He restores your sense of identity, so you stop tying your worth to seasons, roles, or results. You begin to move from a place of wholeness instead of hunger. And in this alignment, God gently heals the parts of you that learn to survive instead of live. Survival taught you how to stay alert, guarded, and ready for the next blow. Alignment teaches you how to trust again, how to soften without becoming weak, how to hope without fear of disappointment. God knows you survived some seasons by staying on edge, and He honors that strength, but He does not want you to stay there. The pause is His invitation to lay down the armor you no longer need. You are not in danger the way you once were. You are not fighting the same battles. Alignment requires you to release old coping mechanisms so you can receive new capacity. When God pauses you, He is also aligning you with the right pace for the next season. What worked before will not sustain what's coming. You cannot run a marathon at a sprint's pace, and God is preparing you for longevity, not burnout. The pause teaches you rhythm. It teaches you when to move and when to rest, when to speak and when to listen, when to push and when to trust. Alignment creates balance, and balance creates endurance. God is not just concerned with you reaching the promise. He is concerned with you enjoying it when you get there. There's a deep peace that comes when you realize the pause is intentional, that God is not confused about where you are, that heaven is not scrambling to fix a mistake. God is deliberate, and His pauses are just as purposeful as His pushes. Alignment means everything begins to come into agreement, even the things that once felt contradictory. Your past starts to make sense. Your pain finds language. Your waiting gains meaning. And you begin to feel steady again, not because everything is resolved, but because you are aligned with God's timing. In this pause, God is teaching you how to trust his pace over your panic, how to believe that what is meant for you will not miss you, how to rest in the assurance that alignment attracts what striving never could. You are learning that being still does not mean being stagnant. There is movement happening beneath the surface, roots growing deeper, faith becoming stronger, vision becoming clearer. Alignment is quiet work, sacred work, necessary work, necessary work. It doesn't always feel productive, but it is profoundly transformative. God's pause is his kindness wrapped in stillness. It is his way of saying, I love you too much to rush you into something that will cost you your peace. It is his way of saying, let me line this up. Let me order this. Let me prepare you. When alignment is complete, movement becomes lighter, decisions become clearer, and peace becomes your companion instead of your reward. You don't move because you're afraid of falling behind. You move because you are confident in God's leading. The pause teaches you that clarity and peace are not found in speed, but in surrender. Every season you survived was not random, and it was not wasted, even the ones that felt unnecessary, overwhelming, or unfair. There were moments when you wondered why God would allow so much pressure to exist in a life that was already trying to honor him. You questioned whether your obedience was being overlooked, whether your prayers were being delayed, or whether you had misunderstood his voice altogether. But survival itself was doing a work in you that comfort never could. God was shaping discernment in places where you once reacted emotionally. He was building resilience where you once felt fragile. He was strengthening faith where you once needed proof. Survival was not about barely making it out alive. It was about being transformed while you stayed. There is a wisdom that only comes from walking through things you didn't choose and still deciding to trust God anyway. You learned how to hear him when the noise was loud. You learned how to depend on him when support was inconsistent. You learned how to keep your heart open when disappointment tempted you to close it off. Those lessons were not accidental. They were essential. God knew that what he was preparing to reveal in 2026 would require more than excitement. It would require maturity. It would require discernment strong enough to recognize blessings without idolizing them, and challenges without being intimidated by them. Survival taught you how to sit with discomfort without running from it. It taught you how to keep going when motivation was gone. It taught you how to show up even when you were unsure of the outcome. Those moments trained your spirit to rely on God's character instead of circumstances. Faith that has never been tested often crumbles when pressure arrives, but faith that has survived storms knows how to stand without shaking. God was not just getting you through hard seasons. He was anchoring you so that when clarity came, it wouldn't knock you off balance. You didn't just survive pain, you survived misunderstanding. You survived being judged for choices people didn't understand and for boundaries they didn't respect. You survived outgrowing spaces that once felt safe and realizing you could not shrink yourself to make others comfortable. Those experiences sharpen your discernment. They taught you how to recognize when something looks familiar but no longer fits. God was training you to trust his voice even when it contradicted popular opinion or personal preference. Discernment grows when you learn the difference between what feels good and what is God. Resilience was built every time you chose not to quit, even when quitting seemed logical. Every time you got up after being knocked down emotionally, spiritually, or mentally, something strengthened within you. Resilience doesn't mean you weren't hurt. It means you refused to let the hurt define you. God watched you cry and still keep moving. He watched you grieve and still believe. That kind of resilience cannot be taught. It must be lived. And it is that resilience that will keep you grounded when 2026 begins to unfold answers you once begged for. Faith was deepened in the waiting, not the loud celebratory faith that shouts promises, but the quiet faith that whispers trust even when nothing changes. You learned how to trust God without timelines. You learned how to praise without evidence. You learned how to rest in God's sovereignty when your understanding fell short. That kind of faith is not shaken by delays or detours. It knows that God is intentional, even when his ways are mysterious. 2026 will reveal things that would have overwhelmed the version of you that demanded immediate results. There were seasons when survival meant letting go of who you thought you would be by now. You released expectations that were built on comparison instead of calling. You released timelines that were shaped by fear instead of faith. That letting go was painful, but it was necessary. God was clearing space for a clear understanding of who you are becoming. Discernment grows when you stop trying to force outcomes and start trusting God's process. Survival refine your vision so that when revelation comes, you will recognize it without confusion. Resilience also taught you boundaries. You learned that not everyone deserves access to your vulnerability. You learned that saying no is not rebellion, it is wisdom. You learned that rest is not laziness, it is stewardship. These lessons were carved into you through survival. God was teaching you how to protect what he placed inside you. When clarity comes, you will need those boundaries to maintain peace. Without them, revelation can become overwhelming instead of empowering. Faith matured when you realized God was present even when he felt silent. You learned that silence is not absence, that waiting is not abandonment, that God does some of his deepest work in seasons where there are no announcements, no applause, and no visible progress. Survival trained you to trust God's unseen hand. That trust will allow you to receive what 2026 reveals without fear, because you have already learned how to lean on him in uncertainty. Every tear you cried watered the soil of wisdom. Every prayer you prayed in desperation strengthened your spiritual awareness. You became more sensitive to God's nudges, more aware of his peace, more attentive to his corrections. Survival refined your ability to discern his voice from your emotions. That discernment is a gift that will guide you through decisions that carry greater weight in the coming season. God does not reveal more without first strengthening the vessel that will carry it. Resilience reshaped your confidence, not confidence rooted in perfection, but confidence anchored in God's faithfulness. You know now that even if things don't go as planned, God remains trustworthy. You know that failure is not fatal and mistakes are not final. That confidence will keep you steady when opportunities expand and responsibilities increase. 2026 will not intimidate you because survival has already proven that God sustains you. Faith was fortified when you chose to believe God's word over your wounds. You refused to let trauma rewrite truth. You refused to let disappointment silence hope. That choice mattered. God honors faith that persists in the face of pain. The clarity that is coming will make sense because your faith has been trained to see beyond the surface. You will recognize God's hand not just in blessings, but in the journey that led you there. Survival also gave you empathy. You can now sit with others in their pain without trying to fix them. You can listen without judgment because you remember how it felt to be misunderstood. That empathy is part of your calling. God often uses those who have survived to bring comfort, clarity, and hope to others. Discernment helps you know when to speak and when to simply be present. Resilience helps you offer support without losing yourself. Faith helps you point people back to God without taking credit for his work. As 2026 approaches, you will begin to see how every hard season was adding layers to your spiritual depth. Nothing was wasted, not the confusion, not the waiting, not the tears. Survival shaped your capacity to receive revelation without being overwhelmed by it. You will understand things now that once frustrated you. You will see connections where there once were questions. You will stand in clarity not because life became easier, but because you became wiser, stronger, and more anchored in God than ever before. There were moments when what you call delay felt like loss, when what you experienced as denial felt like abandonment, and when confusion made you question whether God was truly involved in the details of your life. You replayed conversations, revisited decisions, and wondered if you had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way. But what you could not see then is what you are beginning to understand now. That delays were not punishment, they were protection. Losses were not subtraction, they were redirection. And confusion was not chaos, it was construction. God was building capacity in you for a future that would have crushed an earlier version of you. Some doors didn't just close, they slammed. And it hurt more than you expected because you were already invested emotionally, spiritually, and sometimes even sacrificially. You gave your best, you showed up with sincerity, and you still watched things fall apart. But had those doors stayed open, they would have required you to shrink, compromise, or remain in spaces that could not sustain where God was taking you. Delay stepped in as mercy. God slowed the pace so you would not bind yourself to something that looked good but was not God. Protection doesn't always feel gentle. Sometimes it feels like interruption. There were seasons when you were ready, at least you thought you were, but God withheld what you wanted because he could see what it would cost you. He knew what access without maturity would do to your peace. He knew what visibility without grounding would do to your identity. Delay became the shield you didn't know you needed. While you were waiting, God was strengthening discernment, sharpening boundaries, and healing places that would have been exposed under pressure. What felt like stagnation was actually stabilization. Losses came quietly sometimes and violently at other times. Relationships faded, opportunities dissolved, plans collapsed, and each loss felt like proof that something had gone wrong. But God often removes what we cling to so we don't confuse familiarity with assignment. Some things ended because they were seasonal, not eternal. Some people left because they were aligned with who you were, not who you were becoming. Redirection often looks like loss before it looks like clarity. God was not emptying your life to punish you. He was clearing space to reposition you. There were losses that stripped you of titles, roles, and identities you had wrapped your worth around. That kind of loss feels personal. It makes you question your value, but God will lovingly dismantle identities that limit your growth. He refuses to let you define yourself by something temporary. Redirection is God reminding you that who you are is deeper than what you do and more secure than where you stand right now. Loss reintroduced you to yourself in ways comfort never could. Confusion may have been the hardest part because you didn't know what to expect, where to go, or how to plan. You prayed for clarity, but all you received was silence. You asked for direction, but all you felt was uncertainty. Yet confusion is often the evidence that God is breaking old patterns of thinking. He allows disorientation so you stop leaning on your own understanding. Confusion forces surrender. It teaches you how to trust God without needing to know every step. Construction is messy before it is meaningful. God does some of his deepest work when he dismantles certainty, when you no longer rely on what worked before, when you no longer depend on systems, people, or routines that once gave you confidence. Confusion humbles you into listening again. It softens your heart to instruction. It opens your spirit to divine correction. While you were confused, God was rebuilding your framework so you could hold revelation without fear. And delays trained you to wait without resentment. Losses trained you to release without bitterness. Confusion trained you to listen without controlling the outcome. None of these lessons were accidental. God was shaping your posture. He was teaching you how to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. Redirection required you to let go of what no longer aligned. Protection required you to slow down. Construction required you to trust the process even when it felt uncomfortable. There were times you blamed yourself for the delay, convinced that if you had done more, prayed harder, or moved faster, things would have turned out differently. But some delays had nothing to do with your effort and everything to do with God's foresight. He was shielding you from battles you weren't meant to fight and burdens you weren't meant to carry. Protection is not always about keeping danger away. Sometimes it is about keeping you intact. Loss also exposed attachments you didn't know you had. You realized how tightly you were holding on to outcomes, people, and expectations. God doesn't condemn attachment, but he does challenge dependency. Redirection taught you how to release with faith instead of fear. It taught you that God remains faithful even when familiar structures fall apart. What you lost did not define you. It refined you. Confusion slowed your pace long enough for God to speak to you in new ways. You learned how to recognize his peace instead of relying on external validation. You learned how to move without applause. You learned how to trust his voice over your anxiety. Construction is quiet work. It doesn't announce itself, but it changes everything beneath the surface. While you felt unsure, God was reinforcing your foundation. Now, when you look back, you can see how the delay kept you from settling too soon, how the loss freed you from limitation, how the confusion pushed you into deeper dependence on God. None of it was random. None of it was wasted. God was aligning you with a future that required discernment, humility, and strength. Redirection positioned you where growth could happen without destroying you. You are beginning to understand that what didn't happen protected you. What ended redirected you. What confused you developed you. And what hurt you matured you. God did not allow those seasons to break you. He allowed them to build you. The clarity that is coming will not feel overwhelming because construction prepared you to receive it with peace. There is a season coming where what once felt fragmented will begin to speak to each other, where memories that felt disconnected will line up with meaning, and where questions you carried quietly will finally receive language. You won't have to force understanding anymore. It will arrive gently, almost effortlessly, because God has been working behind the scenes, connecting dots you couldn't see while you were surviving. The pain, the pauses, the prayers, the people who came and went, the detours that frustrated you, all of it will begin to make sense, not because it stopped hurting, but because purpose is now visible. God never wastes suffering. And he never allows endurance without intention. There were moments when you asked yourself why you had to go through so much just to arrive at a place that still felt uncertain. You wondered if the cost was worth it, if the wait was necessary, if the lessons could have come without the loss. But there are understandings that cannot be taught in comfort. There is a wisdom that only grows when faith is stretched and hope is tested. God knew that what he was preparing you for required depth, not just desire. The dots you couldn't connect back then were forming a foundation that would later support clarity without confusion. You survived things that could have hardened you, but instead they softened you in the right places. You learned compassion where you once had judgment. You learned patience where you once demanded immediacy. You learned humility where you once relied on control. These were not accidental traits. They were cultivated through experience. When the dots connect, you will realize that your character was being shaped just as intentionally as your call. God was preparing you to understand success without losing yourself in it. There were patterns you had to break, cycles you had to confront, and beliefs you had to unlearn. Those processes were painful because they challenged who you thought you were and how you thought life should work. But without that disruption, clarity would have arrived too early and done more harm than good. God waits until your heart is ready to interpret his blessings correctly. When the dots connect, you won't idolize the outcome because you understand the journey that led you there. Some of the dots were people relationships that taught you what love is and what it is not, connections that revealed your boundaries and your blind spots.